Hey everybody, welcome to another video review. So I don't think I've done this ever, so bear with me. It's going to be a little bit, like with everything you try for the first time, be a little bit awkward. So tonight I'd like to review not like a statue or a miniature or any of that stuff. I wanted to review a book. Just sort of like in the past, I used to review some movies. Weren't those the good old days when we could actually see movies in movie theaters? But today I like to review a type of book called a game book, which is something I used to play a lot of when I was younger, mainly in junior high school. And I got a little bit more into it just because I was nostalgic for the past. And the game book I like to review two of them, but I'll do it in separate videos. So the book that I like to review is from a series of books called Ace Gamebooks. It's written by an author named Jonathan Green, and he has quite a history for writing game books. So I'm going to show you right here. This is the game book I'm going to review. It's called Neverland. Here Be Monsters, as you can see in the Ace game book by Jonathan Green. And before getting, as you can see, it's like a massive book. So before getting into reviewing the book, I guess some background should be given for those of you who really don't know what a game book is. So basically, this was pretty big, I think, in the 80s mainly, and maybe 90s, where it's a type of book where instead of reading it from cover to cover like a traditional novel, they call it a game book because you read it in sections, and typically at the end of sections, you'll be asked to choose which way you want to go. There'll be decisions, how you want to approach things. So the most famous version of this, of course, is a choose your own adventure, right? Where you literally are choosing your own adventure. And depending on what you choose, you have many, many different endings. I read that a little bit, but I was never like a big fan of that because it just seemed very empty to me because a lot of the endings were just sort of not very interesting. And you just had all these different endings. And there was a few good ones, a few horrible ones, obviously a few ones where you died or whatever. But it didn't feel very fulfilling. And so the ones I really loved were this series of game books called Fighting Fantasy. And they were created by Steve Jackson and Ian Livingston from the United Kingdom. And I might do some reviews of that later on. I own all of the Fighting Fantasy game books, which those of you who know that that's not an easy thing to do. A lot of those are out of print. But Fighting Fantasy had quite a bit of a renaissance. In the early 2000s, a lot of their books were reprinted. And, happily both Steve Jackson and Ian Livingston are both alive and well and with us. And the thing that separates Fighting Fantasy game books from Choose Your Own Adventure is the game part of it, which means that, number one, they tend to be a lot more difficult. They also tell typically more of a cohesive story where, you're like a hero, there's a hero's quest, an adventure, it focuses on you, and there's like a beginning and an end, and you're typically given a quest that you have to achieve, you have to get items, and there's only one way to get the best ending. Now, throughout the Fighting Fantasy game book, there's many opportunities to make decisions. And if you make the wrong decisions, you'll usually just wind up dying, okay? Or you will finally get to the point of the game where it will demand that you have certain things. And if you don't have those things, then the game will just end. And so I like the challenge of that compared to Choose Your Own Adventure because it means that there's more of a challenge. You have to really take notes. Sometimes you have to map. And it could take quite a number of tries before, you're able to finally figure out exactly what to do and go where to go to get the final ending. And again, in the vast majority of these game books, Fighting Fantasy game books, there's only one good ending versus Choose Your Own Adventure, which just has a lot of endings, and not one is particularly better than the other of a certain class. And then the game part is that during the course of the adventure, you may be asked to fight monsters. And then to fight the monsters, you have to roll dice, you have to engage in combat. There are other points in the Fighting Fantasy Gamebook where you might have to do checks against your luck or stamina or skill, for instance, and so you're rolling dice. And so not only must you find the optimal route to the one true good ending, but you also have to be somewhat fortunate, because you might get involved in situations where you may actually lose the dice roll. You may not be able to have the good die rolls. You may actually get killed, fighting a monster. And so all of that added up to the challenge of these game books. So fighting fantasy was very, very big back when I was growing up. And the author here, Jonathan Green, wrote quite a few game books. If you go on his blog and you check him up, he's written a lot of game books, but he, I think, started with fighting fantasy, and he wrote quite a few fighting. I think he's written at least 7 or 8 of them. And he wrote near the tail end of the fighting fantasy series, and then also came back for the revival. And he has written one of what is considered one of the best fighting fantasy game books in the entire series. And now I think they're up to 74 total books. And if you include the Sorcery sub-series by Steve Jackson, Jonathan Green wrote this game book called How the Werewolf, which a lot of people who care about these things, who like these things, often they feel like this is probably one of the best fighting fantasy game books. It's up there with Creature of Havoc by Steve Jackson and the Sorcery series, 4-book series, again by Steve Jackson, and ranked up there with Death Trap Dungeon by Ian Livingstone, for instance, and some of the other classics. And so, fighting fantasy is a little bit slow right now. I think Scholastic is publishing right now. And so, Jonathan Green kind of went on and started doing his own game book series. And they're called the Ace game book, because the 3 attributes that are used in this game book are agility, combat, and endurance. So, ACE. And he's written so far 5 of them, and the 6th one is pending. And the way that these books are done is that they don't go through like a traditional publisher. I think the publisher here is a Snow Books. I don't know the exact contract, but typically, Jonathan will actually fund these books through Kickstarter funding. And so there'll be a lot of exclusives and, Easter eggs. And if you're familiar with Kickstarter.com, there's a lot of tiers of rewards and things like that. And so that's how he funds the books. So I've managed to buy book 2, 3, 4, 5. Now book 6, I actually did fund late, but luckily there's still the opportunity to fund. The only book I'm missing, sadly, is the first one, which is Alice's Nightmare in Wonderland, which is the first book that kind of got all of this started. And I'm hopeful to get that eventually as part of the latest Kickstarter, which is based on Dracula. He gave you the opportunity to buy the earlier books. And so I did buy Alice, and I'm hoping to get it. If you don't have that, it's almost impossible to find. It goes for like $900, some ridiculous, like $800, $900, $1,000 on the secondary book market if you can even find it. So hopefully, with that type of demand, I'm hoping that both Jonathan and Snowflake Books will understand that and reprint it. There was a run of 100 hardback that was sold out very quickly when he did it on a Kickstarter. It was just earlier this year, which I didn't really know about. So that's the background again on the author and the type of books these are. So they are Choose Your Own Adventure, and they're written by a guy who's really good at writing these type of books. It takes a pretty unique skill set. Writing these books are not like writing obviously normal novels. And he's gotten quite a bit better over time. I enjoyed a lot of his fighting fantasy books, and so it was natural for me to gravitate to his own series and see what he can come up with. and how far he can sort of push the genre. So with all of that explained, what is the premise of Neverland, Here Be Monsters? So the first thing I think to notice about the book is it's gigantic. Most game books are very thin. Fighting fantasy traditionally has 400 sections. A related series of books called Lone Wolf by Joe Deaver, which is, I have all of those too, and I'll make a video about that at a later time, separate video, but their sections about 350 sections. So for a game book, 400 sections is about par for the course. Sometimes for something that's a little bit more complicated, you may add an extra 20, 30 sections or 50 sections even. So the first thing I noticed about this book is it's huge, and it has a total of 900 sections. I'm looking at this right now just to be sure. So 900 sections, which is over double the length of any normal game book, especially of Fighting Fantasy, which is sort of the seminal series for this type of work. So that's number one. It's pretty amazing. Okay, and then number two is the sort of the background of the book. So it's called Neverland. So what Jonathan did with this is he combined the setting of Peter Pan and Wendy, along with sort of like the Lost World by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So he kind of combined those two settings, and he put all these like dinosaurs and prehistoric monsters into essentially Neverland, and he gave it his own twist. There's a kind of there's a steampunk aspect to it, and then there's also sort of this prehistoric wilderness aspect to it. He kind of mashed all of this stuff together with characters, of course, that most people will be very familiar with. And so the reason that there's so many sections and the conceit behind it is that through the course of this book, you can actually play as multiple characters. So in Neverland, Here Be Monsters, you get to play 4 characters. You get to play either as Wendy, as Peter Pan, as Tiger Lily, or as Captain Hook. Now, of course, the story here derives inspiration from the source material, but it's completely different characters with, again, Jonathan's own take on it. So kind of reviewing the book, number one, it's definitely, you definitely get your bang for the buck. You definitely get your money's worth, because what's happening is when you play the book, you literally can play it 4 times. So it's almost like 4 game books in one. And you can play it 4 times, and each time is like kind of a different experience, and you look at the events from different characters' points of view. I've never played a game book quite like that before. All of the other game books in the past, it's just a very solitary, it's one person and you play through it. So this is the first time where I got to play it from that perspective, and it kind of shows Jonathan's ingenuity in terms of making all of that work, because there are some sections where it's still kind of like the same story with the same major beats, but then he will show that story from different points of view, and then he may change different aspects, but it's still very much the same thing, with the same ending necessarily. And so you have to kind of look at it from different points of view. And so how he does it is that there's certain sections where you'll have a symbol, and each character has a unique symbol, and then based on the symbol you see, you're given instructions, like you have to either add 10 to the section and read another section, or subtract 20 and go to another section. And so each character has that. So when you play through the book, it's really cool to play through it the first time, like say as Wendy, and then play through and do the same events from the perspective of, say, Captain Hook. So that was really, really fun. Looking or reviewing in general, the writing, I think the writing quality is a step above what you would normally expect from a game book. Remember that most game books are for, the market is dominated by preteen boys who are not known for being big readers. So typically the language is about on par with that. And so when I read Neverland, Here Be Monsters, Jonathan Green's prose and vocabulary definitely felt a bit more advanced than that. There were vocabulary words that even I was not immediately familiar with. I had to kind of check up. It felt like high school, early college level. So there's a sophistication, I think, to the language and to the descriptions that you don't normally find in a typical game book. So I felt that the quality of the writing, quality of the prose is very good. And normally for game books, that's not really the focus because a lot of the time it's a game, right? And so it's very like workmanlike is what I like to say. Like a lot of the language in these game books are very workmanlike. And that's definitely not the case with, with Jonathan Green's Ace game books. It also kind of harkens back to what Joe Deaver did with Lone Wolf, where in the beginning it was a bit more simplistic, but as we got further on the series, it became clear that Joe Deaver was kind of telling an epic story in game book format. And after a while, it became clear, at least to me, that if he had the chance, he would have rather just maybe ditched the entire game book part of it and just basically delved into writing about Lone Wolf himself. Because I remember reading near the end of the series, like books say 15 to 20, where one of the sections would be like 2 pages, and just basically it would be like regular prose, and they would just end with this very simple choice, and then you would go on into another 3-page section. I always remember that part of it. So again, there was more sophisticated writing, with the later parts of Lone Wolf, and so it is with Neverland. I think that the story is really, really good. I don't want to necessarily spoil it too much for you. But just suffice to say, you're exploring the Neverland from different perspectives. There are certain things that have to happen. I don't want to spoil. So there's certain major seminal events of the story that's going to happen no matter what. But others are going to be a little bit different. For instance, if you play as Wendy or Peter or Tiger Lily, winning the book is obviously going to have a very different ending than if you play as Captain Hook, who's the villain, right? From Captain Hook's point of view, if you play him, you're not going to end Captain Hook's playthrough with him dying. You're going to end with him living and being victorious. And so obviously there are going to be some subtle shifts, but the major events are still the same. It's the interesting thing is you're seeing it from the different perspectives. So I think the story overall was very enjoyable. You recognize all of the characters, but then you also kind of enjoyed his steampunk twist to it. So that was also very good as well. And I also mentioned the fact that you get to appreciate his ingenuity as you begin to sort of see how he weaves 4 narratives of different perspectives all through at the same time. You see how he repeats certain sections but modifies it slightly so that it makes sense for each character. You see how he sort of tries to be efficient, and he can use some sections that might technically be appropriate for all 4 characters, or he'll use the same section but he has to change them slightly because 4 characters are going to be going through the events in different ways. And you see how he kind of weaves all of that into this 900 section book. So I played through the book with every single character, and I even went down every single potential tree just to read about what happens. So I thoroughly, I went through every one of these 900 sections, I think. So I thoroughly enjoyed that aspect of it. So that was the first Ace game book I read, and it was very positive, made a very positive impression on me. I really loved it, and even for me, I read pretty quickly, but I'm a little bit obsessive compulsive. It took me like a good, I would say 3 to 4 nights. So I don't read nonstop through the day. I have other things I have to do, but at night, I would sit down with it, and it took me 3 to 4 nights to get through every single one of the sections and to really, really enjoy it. Okay, so for sure, I would recommend that you get it. It's still in print. This was published, I think, just a few years ago. The only book that's like really hard, if not impossible to get, is Alice. But the rest of the series, is absolutely obtainable for a reasonable price. I think this one is £10, British pounds, which is about $13, $14 US. it'll set you back probably 20-25 by the time you're putting shipping. So if you have a chance to get it, definitely get it. Now, are there any criticisms of the book? Not a whole lot. I think the only criticism some people will come up with, which I can kind of see their viewpoint, is that the story is not drastically different depending on the characters. And so again, without spoiling it, certain things just are going to happen no matter what. You're looking at it from different perspectives. And so one of the complaints was, it's not radically different. But I have to disagree on that, because I think that, but I think that, in my opinion, I think that Wendy and Peter are linked together. And so Wendy and Peter's arc through the game book are a little bit similar. I mean, there are going to be differences again, but they're essentially the same story, just from different points of view. But I think Tiger Lily has a radically different story, and you follow her also very differently. And so I think she is very unique. And of course, Captain Hook is completely off the rails, completely different. And so I think that the three story arcs, Tiger Lily's, Captain Hook's, and then Peter Wendy's together, I think they're very, very unique by themselves. Of course, the quest, what happens ultimately to the island, those things don't change, but I think the story is different as far as that goes. Another thing is that because there's so many characters, one criticism is that the adventure is not as long as, say, a dedicated adventure. I mean, I think each of these character arcs is probably a little bit shorter than the average fighting fantasy game book. But again, you haven't really finished the story unless you've looked at it from every single character's perspective. And each run through with a different character, because you're playing it differently, each character has different attributes, they have different powers, they have different abilities they can use, along with the narrative. It adds a lot to the actual experience. And so I certainly don't begrudge the content, even though each individual story may be a little bit shorter, the totality of the experience is amazing. And the final thing I think is that the book might be a little touch easy, meaning that fighting fantasy typically have a lot of branches, and so sometimes you can really screw up. You're asked to get a lot of different items, like Ian Livingstone is famous for the so-called treasure hunt or MacGuffin hunt, where to get to the end of the Ian Livingstone's game book, you typically have to get like 7-8 items. If you're missing one of them, you're not going to be able to make it. You'll fail. So Neverland Here Be Monsters doesn't quite do that, which I think is okay, because sometimes you do that, it feels a little cheap. It's almost like a cheap way of adding difficulty or adding content. But I can also see that some of the criticism is that it is a little bit too easy. You're probably not going to get stuck on it. There's not a lot of puzzles where you have to, for instance, figure out a certain numeric code and go turn to that section. There's really none of that. And so it's an enjoyable read, an enjoyable mechanic, but it's not very challenging, okay, as far as that goes. So those are the main criticisms, which I think you may or may not agree with, depending on how sensitive you are about these things, which is each individual adventure is a little bit shorter, and that it's not very challenging, and that sometimes the uniqueness of each story might be a little bit lacking, because again, major events are still covered no matter what, and still happen no matter what. But I think that the positives far outweigh that. I had a great time reading it. And so again, if you have a chance to pick it up, go pick it up. It's well worth the money. One of the better game books I've personally played, and again, really enjoyed going through it multiple times. And there's a lot of different paths. Without giving too much away, there is one part of the book where you, along with your allies, are asked to go to 4 different locations, okay? And each character goes and chooses one of the locations. It's a 4 or 3? it might be 3. I tend to forget because I just read The Wicked Wizard of Oz, where it was 4. But in essence, it's the same mechanic, where you're asked to go to one of 3 or 4 locations. I believe it's 3 locations in Neverland, yeah. And each of the characters, of course, can go to each of the locations, which means that if you do the probability math or the permutation math, there's like 12 potential combinations, right, of what you can choose if you're choosing one character, and they have to play through each location because the character can't go to every single location. So that's just an example of the replay value, where you can finish the book, but then you want to go back and you're going to want to read the book again because you want to go down another path. And so there's a lot, again, to experience. And so I will end it by, oh, that's right, there's the one, it's not really a criticism, it's just an inescapable fact. I was going to end it by saying that there is an Easter egg in the book. Normally when you start the adventure, depending on what character you're going to play, they're going to say you need to start at a certain section. So for instance, it says, this is the first page of the book when the book starts. It says, Neverland, here be monsters. Second to the right and straight on till morning. It's time to begin your adventure. If you're playing as Wendy Darling, turn to section 1. If you're playing as Peter Pan, turn to section 150. If you're playing as Tiger Lily, turn to section 300. And if you're playing as Captain James Hook, turn to section 450. So again, depending on the section you're playing, you have to go to that section and then you begin the adventure. So the Easter egg is that completely hidden in the book with no prompt, but on section 65, you get to play through the entire adventure as the crocodile, as the alligator, I guess, from Peter Pan. It's a prehistoric version of that crocodile. It says, you are Dinosuchus, majestic ruler of rivers, mighty monarch of the waterways, emperor of the estuaries, lord of the marshes, king of crocodiles. And it's not a long adventure, but it's like a blast because you get to play it as essentially the crocodile. So what game book would come up with that? So that's amazing. Now, the reason he put it in there is because that was one of the tiered gifts for backers of the Kickstarter. So therein you have a little bit of controversy. Obviously, you want to reward the people who invested the most money in these game books when they were backing it on the Kickstarter.com website. So it's a little reward Easter egg for those people. But at the same time, if you bought the book, it's a little bit disconcerting that you can't really enjoy the entire book because you weren't one of the original backers, And so I do wonder if enough time has passed, it would be not unreasonable to let people in on the secret, right? That you can play as that because it does add quite a bit of value to the book. So in this case, there's not just 4 characters, there's actually a hidden 5th one. I don't know if there's more hidden ones, I don't think so, but the only way obviously for me to find out would be to actually flip through each one of the 900 sections to make sure that there's no hidden treasure. And maybe someday I will do it, but you can imagine that would take quite a bit of time to do so. So again, what more can you ask for? You can play as Wendy, Peter, Captain Hook, and Tiger Lily, and then the crocodile to boot. That's a pretty amazing combination. So once again, I'll end the video by just saying Neverland, Here Be Monsters. It's one of the Ace game books by Jonathan Green, and it's still in print, and it's one of the better game books that I've read because of everything I've talked about. So please go and support him. He's not like a huge author. A lot of this is, again, kickstarting, independent publishing. But he does very, very good work, so I feel like he does deserve absolutely to be supported. And the next video, when I have a chance, I'll talk about the second book in the series, which is The Wicked Wizard of Oz. This is the 3rd book, actually, but it's the one I read first. And so it's kind of an interesting dynamic that I read this first and then The Wicked Wizard of Oz after, even though The Wicked Wizard of Oz came out first. So until next time, I hope you enjoyed this review and it'll pick your interest to see if you would be interested in reading this. But until next time, do take care.